January 20th, 2026 did not begin with commemorative speeches or celebratory cannon fire in Washington. It began with a calculated silence, the unnerving silence of an economic engine suddenly severed from its power source. What we are witnessing right now, ladies and gentlemen, is not a standard parade. Preliminary reports confirm a staggering figure, over 600 distinct events occurring simultaneously across all 50 states. From the bustling container ports of Long Beach to the financial centers of Chicago and extending even into conservative strongholds in Texas, an unprecedented phenomenon is unfolding. This is not the Women's March of 2017 with its pink knitted hats and witty slogans. This is what organizers are calling the Free America Walkout, and its objective is far colder: to paralyze the functional capacity of the nation. We must look squarely at the nature of this event. Throughout American political history, protests have largely been symbolic, a way to voice dissent. But today's event marks a dangerous shift from protest to coercion. By calling on workers to abandon their posts, from teachers and nurses to air traffic controllers, this movement is weaponizing labor itself to create massive political leverage. Sociological observers note that this is the closest approximation to a general strike, a concept traditionally alien and often deemed radical in American political culture, yet one that is now manifesting before our eyes on the one-year anniversary of President Trump's term. Why now, and why at this scale? Critics of the administration argue that the past 365 days have been sufficient to demonstrate the necessity of drastic action, while the president's supporters view this as organized economic sabotage intended to undermine a constitutional term. The polarization is no longer confined to ballots. It has spilled onto the streets and infiltrated the supply chain. Look at the data. Transport unions on the East Coast report sudden personnel drops, and major city school districts have been forced to close due to teacher shortages. This is a message written not in ink, but in the cessation of commercial flow. But the most pressing question we must ask at this juncture is, how? How could such a vast network be activated with such minute-to-minute synchronization without being detected or preempted by intelligence agencies? Is this truly a spontaneous civic movement, or is there an invisible architect maneuvering this chessboard from the shadows? The uncanny coordination between disparate interest groups suggests we are missing a critical variable in this power equation. And as night falls on this tumultuous anniversary, a leaked piece of intelligence from the White House is beginning to circulate, promising to fundamentally alter how we perceive this confrontation in the hours to come. If the leak from the West Wing serves as the spark, then the diverse social terrain of America is providing the dry kindling for this conflagration. We must momentarily avert our gaze from the stifling corridors of power in Washington to train our lens on the West Coast, specifically Alameda, California. Here, dissent does not manifest as disorganized chaos, but rather as a military-grade structure of civic will. Observers describe this phenomenon as a human wall, a hand-in-hand chain stretching for miles along the coastline where thousands stand in nearly absolute silence, facing the fog-laden ocean. This visual anchor is profound. Silicon Valley tech workers standing shoulder to shoulder with university students and immigrant laborers, creating a silent yet fortified front line. This is not impulsiveness. This is carefully choreographed objection, carrying the hues of highly organized civil disobedience reminiscent of the 1960s, but with 21st century discipline. However, let us execute a sharp pivot to the sun-drenched, sweltering plazas of San Antonio, Texas. The contrast here could not be more stark. If Alameda is the stillness of an iceberg, San Antonio is a simmering crater. Here, beneath the shadow of the Alamo, that historical symbol of the last stand, the gatherings take on a much more confrontational nature. There is no meditative silence here. The air is thick with chanting, megaphones, and the friction of diametrically opposed ideologies. Proponents of the president's hardline border policies and opponents of deportation stand at a dangerously close proximity, separated only by a thin veneer of local law enforcement. The Texas heat seems to resonate with the political temperature, creating an atmosphere that sociologists might term extreme social kinetics. This poses a direct question to us. Are we witnessing two different nations coexisting within a single border? This division is not merely geographical, it is an epistemological fracture. The way citizens in Alameda define patriotism seems entirely alien to those waving flags in San Antonio, and while news cameras focus on this surface-level cacophony, on the placards and the raised fists, another undercurrent is beginning to reveal itself. The synchronization in organization across these two locations, separated by thousands of miles, cannot be coincidental. There is an invisible hand, an architect of chaos or order, conducting this rhythm. And what we have just uncovered regarding the funding streams behind these protests will make you shudder at the depth of intervention by unelected powers. If in the previous chapter we exposed the financial architecture, the invisible lifeblood sustaining the scale of these demonstrations, here we must confront the agonizing heartbeat of this movement, the human element. Money can charter buses, print placards, and establish sound systems, but it cannot purchase the visceral tears of outrage or the moral ferment currently radiating from the East Coast to the West. All this organized chaos finds its spiritual fulcrum in the name Renee Good, a private tragedy selected by history to become the symbol of the collision between state power and the human condition. Renee Good, an 18-year-old, was neither a political activist nor a threat to national security. She was merely an individual caught in the colossal bureaucratic machinery of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, IC. Preliminary reports, though still the subject of fierce contention, indicate she passed away due to complications from a stroke while in custody, a death that critics argue was entirely preventable absent the systemic delays in medical access. This is precisely the societal breaking point, when the rigidity of the law crashes against the fragility of life. In the eyes of the angry multitudes outside, Good's death is not simply a regrettable medical incident. It is a searing indictment of the zero-tolerance policy the current administration is pursuing. We are witnessing a classic socio-psychological phenomenon, where a single victim becomes the converging lens for all suppressed discontent. ICE, the agency tasked with border protection, has now, in the eyes of the opposing public, transformed into the embodiment of a cold leviathan, a state monster devouring humanity in the name of order. The image of a young woman collapsing in the solitude of a federal holding cell possesses a destructive power greater than any political speech. It poses a stinging question to the American conscience. Are we trading the nation's soul for the illusion of border security? This outrage is not accidental. It is the inevitable consequence when macro policies ignore the micro details of human dignity. However, what is more concerning than the tragedy itself is how it is being weaponized. Good's death is being used as a moral lever to legitimize a direct challenge to federal authority. But let us be wary, for when emotion overrides reason in politics, the consequences are often unpredictable. And while the crowd chants her name like a martyr, another storm is forming from within the Oval Office itself, where the president's reaction is not one of appeasement, but of a cold strategic calculation. The cold strategic calculation from the Oval Office leads us to a political maneuver far more sophisticated than the chaotic jeers on the streets. What the protest organizers are executing is not merely resistance, it is a masterclass in symbolic multiplexing. By deliberately synchronizing the one-year anniversary of President Trump's inauguration with the Martin Luther King Jr. holiday weekend, the opposition has engaged in a hostile takeover of history, grafting contemporary policy grievances onto the sacred rootstock of the 1960s civil rights movement. This is no accident. It is semantic alchemy. Observe closely the visual anchors being deployed. Crowds gathering at the Lincoln Memorial, the very steps where Dr. King stood, are not simply protesting a tax bill or an immigration statute. They are attempting to osmose the moral aura of 1963. In doing so, mundane battles over budget allocation or judicial appointments are suddenly sublimated into a moral crusade. This tactic creates a brutal binary trap for the White House. If the administration attacks the protesters this weekend, they will be framed as attacking the legacy of Dr. King himself. It is a political shield forged from historical memory, rendering any conservative critique instantly tone-deaf and seemingly cruel. But we must ask a direct question. Is this historical appropriation truly sustainable? There is a latent risk in equating the political discomfort of the modern middle class with the visceral suffering of the Jim Crow era. When every policy disagreement is labeled a human rights crisis, language suffers from inflation and loses its inherent gravity. Critics argue that donning the mantle of one's predecessors does not make one's arguments more valid, only louder. Yet, in the short term, the optical effect is undeniable. Anti-Trump banners intermingled with the iconography of Dr. King create a powerful emotional resonance on television, completely eclipsing the economic messaging the president is attempting to broadcast. While the opposition is intoxicated by this symbolic victory, believing they have seized the moral high ground, they have overlooked a fundamental truth of realpolitik. Emotion may ignite a crowd, but structure dictates the game. And while the cameras are fixated on the soaring rhetoric at the National Mall, the president's strategists are not panicking. In fact, they have identified a fracture within this coalition, a fatal demographic vulnerability that the mainstream media is ignoring, and they are preparing to exploit it with a razor-sharp political weapon. While the cameras were busy with the inspiring speeches at the National Mall, the president's strategists were not panicked. In fact, they saw a crack in this coalition, a fatal demographic weakness that the mainstream media is ignoring, and they prepared to exploit it with a sharp political weapon. However, to understand their counterattack, one must first dissect the target itself. What we are witnessing in this fifth phase is no longer the chaotic, spontaneous combustion of public outrage that characterized the early months. The visceral screams of the street have been metabolized into the dry, procedural, and infinitely more dangerous language of the 501c4 tax code. This is the transition from the winter of rage to the era of the machine. Consider the phenomenon of the No Kings movement. To the casual observer, it appears as a loose collection of signs and slogans. But look closer, past the visuals of the crowd, and you see the unmistakable architecture of a permanent political infrastructure. This is not a flash mob. It is a holding company for grievances. By leveraging the opacity of social welfare organizations, this movement has constructed a financial pipeline that turns momentary viral anger into sustained legal warfare. It is the difference between a flash flood, destructive but brief, and a hydroelectric dam, which harnesses the pressure to generate power for a decade. We have seen this evolution before, albeit on a smaller scale, during the crystallization of the Tea Party or the maturation of the environmental lobby. But the No Kings apparatus is distinct in its systemic integration. They are not merely protesting policy. They are creating a parallel civic structure designed to challenge the very legitimacy of executive discretion. Every chant on the street is backed by a subpoena in the courts. Every marcher is represented by a lobbyist in the corridors of power. This is the industrialization of dissent. The danger for the administration is not that the protests will burn down buildings, that ironically would be easier to police, but that the protests will bog down the gears of government in a layer of bureaucratic glue that no executive order can dissolve. It is a strategy of attrition, not confrontation. But as this shadow bureaucracy solidifies its grip, creating a stalemate that seems unbreakable, a whisper begins to circulate through the West Wing. There is a countermeasure, a nuclear option residing deep within the interpretation of the 14th Amendment that the president's legal team is quietly polishing, a move so audacious it could either shatter the opposition entirely or fracture the republic itself. While constitutional scholars debate the esoteric clauses of the 14th Amendment in hushed mahogany-lined libraries, a far more visceral and perhaps more damaging conflict is unfolding on the damp pavement of Pennsylvania Avenue. We are witnessing a shift from policy confrontation to an asymmetric war of imagery, where the dark arts of character assassination are deployed with calculated ruthlessness. Observers in Washington, D.C. cannot help but notice a change in the texture of these protests. It is no longer merely about chanting slogans regarding tariffs or borders. Instead, the capital's streets have transformed into a gallery of outrage, where installation art and visual performances are weaponized. Most notable and most controversial is the persistent emergence of the Epstein factor, a specter from the past summoned by the opposition to cast a long shadow over the one-year anniversary. Political analysts perceive that the use of imagery and historical allegations linking to Jeffrey Epstein is not intended to build a legal case. That is a matter for the courts, but rather to create an indelible moral stain in the minds of centrist voters. Consider the tableau. Massive digital projections cast upon the brutalist facades of government buildings in the dead of night, creating ghostly, flickering caricatures that no press secretary can easily rebut with a written statement. This is an attack on the subconscious, bypassing reason to strike directly at the emotions of revulsion and suspicion. Unlike the traditional protests of the 1960s, this tactic bears the hallmarks of modern psychological operations, psyops, where the line between fact, rumor, and artistic symbolism is deliberately blurred. The erection of temporary satirical effigies in plain view is not just resistance. It is an attempt to strip the president of legitimacy, not through the ballot box, but through public humiliation. The question arises, will this strategy of visual smearing be effective, or will it backfire, provoking a fierce defensive reaction from the loyal base? History suggests that when politics abandons policy debate to descend into personal attacks below the belt, the republic often suffers deep scars. But while this war of images dazzles the media and captures every camera lens, another tectonic shift, quieter but infinitely more dangerous, is silently occurring in the shadows of Silicon Valley. A power that needs no banners, no shouting, yet holds the authority to shape the reality of millions, is about to enter the chessboard. But while this war of images dazzles the media and captures every camera lens, another tectonic shift, quieter but infinitely more dangerous, is silently occurring in the shadows of Silicon Valley. A power that needs no banners, no shouting, yet holds the authority to shape the reality of millions, is about to enter the chessboard. It is the algorithm, and it has just received a new set of instructions. Yet, if we gaze only at the screens, we miss the genuine friction grinding the gears of governance in Washington. The protesters' chants of fascism, a term historically overused yet currently resonating with specific anxieties, are not merely rhetorical flourishes. They point to a tangible shift in the architecture of governance. We are witnessing what constitutional scholars might term executive aggrandizement. The administration, citing paralyzed legislative chambers and urgent national security imperatives, appears to be pivoting toward governance by decree rather than consensus. The visual anchor here is not the flames on the street, but the pen signing executive orders in rapid succession, bypassing the deliberative breaks intentionally designed by the founding fathers. Supporters label this necessary decisiveness in an era of global chaos. They argue that a slow government is a weak, vulnerable government. Conversely, the opposition perceives the systematic dismantling of the administrative state through the firing of career officials and the centralization of law enforcement directives as the removal of the very guardrails designed to prevent tyranny. One must ask, is this the necessary streamlining of a bloated bureaucracy or the dangerous consolidation of power into a single pair of hands? The friction is palpable. It is the sound of norms breaking. James Madison wrote in Federalist No. 51 that ambition must be made to counteract ambition. But what occurs when one branch overpowers the others through the sheer force of populist mandate? The courts are reacting, but with glacial slowness. The legislature is deeply fractured. And amidst this institutional gridlock, the executive branch is creating new realities on the ground. We are left to question, can the Constitution withstand a stress test where efficiency is prioritized over checks and balances? As the institutions groan under this pressure, a final existential question emerges, one that transcends laws and touches the very spirit of the Republic. History, however, is not merely a record of events. It is the ultimate judge of what Thomas Hobbes and John Locke termed the social contract. As we close the file on this tumultuous one-year anniversary, we are forced to confront a philosophical consequence far more profound than the protests in the streets, the withdrawal of consent. American democracy operates not on the muscle of police or military might, but on a fragile miracle. The voluntary belief of the citizenry that the government, whether they voted for it or not, possesses legitimate authority. What we are witnessing through these massive demonstrations is not merely dissatisfaction with tax policy or immigration statutes. It is a symptom of an epistemological fissure where a vast segment of the body politic refuses to recognize the moral authority of the helmsman. Consider the concept of governability. In a healthy republic, laws are obeyed primarily out of habit and respect, not out of fear of retribution. But when the contract erodes, when millions take to the streets not to demand a change in law, but to negate the lawgiver, the cost of governance skyrockets exponentially. How long can a government, whether Trump's or any other, survive if it must constantly expend political capital just to maintain basic order? Observers worry that we are sliding from a society based on consensus to a state scholars call coerced stability, where the silence of the crowd does not signify agreement, but merely the biding of time. But we must ask ourselves, is this breach healable, or have we crossed a Rubicon of the mind? Madison, in the Federalist Papers, warned of the dangers of faction, but he could scarcely have imagined a scenario where reality itself is bifurcated into parallel universes, where each side views the other not as political opponents, but as existential threats. The erosion of faith in institutions, from the courts to Congress to the presidency itself, is administering an unprecedented stress test to the U.S. Constitution. Ultimately, as the echoes of these protests either fade or mutate into a new form, America stands not at the brink of collapse, but at the precipice of redefinition. The American experiment was never guaranteed perpetual success. It requires the constant tending of every generation. What has transpired in this first year is a stark reminder that the republic does not die in darkness, but it can wither in the glaring light of irreconcilable division. The question is no longer who wins or loses this term, but whether, after the dust settles, we still possess a shared language with which to call one another countrymen.